Good morning, everybody. Good morning. Thank you very much. It's really great that everybody's made it for today's special presentation on the behalf of the Department of Otolaryngology, Head and Neck Surgery, the Department of Neurological Surgery, the Department of Biological Structure, and the Research and Graduate Education Vice Dean Office. We're excited to present Dr. Michael Taffe from UCSD, and he's gonna give us today's presentation. Dr. Taffe's originally from New Hampshire, I found out, but he did his undergraduate work at Colorado College, then moved to San Diego, and he's been there ever since. He was a graduate student at UCSD, then was a postdoc and took a faculty position at Scripps. And then they lured him back to UCSD about 5 years ago, where he's now currently a professor in the Department of Psychiatry. And Dr. Taffe's research area is on drugs of abuse and the neuropharmacology underlying that. And in fact, today at 12:30, he's going to be giving a research talk in K069 on that topic. But this morning, and the reason I'm really excited that he is here, he's going to tell us about inequity in grant review. And a couple of years ago, I read an article in eLife where he talked about the continuing disparity between the grant review process at NIH and underrepresented groups. And I think this is an incredibly important topic, and I'm really excited for him to tell us about that today. The title of his talk is "The Funding is the Science, DEI, and NIH Grant Award." So please join me in welcoming Mike. Thank you.
Thanks everybody for coming, and thanks for inviting me. I really like being able to talk about these issues. I often describe this as having an unhealthy interest in how science is conducted. I have no conflicts, pursuant to this talk, except for the fact that I'm a frequent applicant to the NIH for funding. And so that gives me a bit of an interest. Right up at the top, I'm going to talk about two things. I'm going to talk about equity for individuals, and I'm going to talk about things that are related to the value of diversity for institutions. And I just want to point out that because I conflate these two things, it's not meant to imply that the justice and equity for individuals is only in service to the good for the institution. But I do think we can, walk and chew gum at the same time. Okay, so this alumni magazine turned at my house. I'm a Husky only by marriage. So I was kind of interested, this just a few months ago, and sort of this retrospective from some doctors that came here in '74, and they pointed out how important it was in Seattle's area for Black residents to have diversity amongst the doctors, and pointed out this improves access, quality of care for underserved populations, things that we're all talking about nowadays. But it was sort of interesting. You sort of go down through the article, and you find that in '74, there were the 6 Black students in their class of 125, which I calculated to be about 4.8%. And today there are 6 in a class of 270, which is 2.2%. Things are going backwards. And this is common, well, maybe not the backwards, but certainly things not improving is relatively common across all of academia. This is a summary of your faculty. And of course, I had to look up that the state of Washington has 12.4% Black citizens, and your faculty, and this is all faculty, I assume, is 4.3% Black, and presumably it's worse in the biomedical sciences because that tends to be the reality for most institutions. So today we're going to talk about the NIH grant funding disparity. I want to talk to you a little bit about that, but we're going to hopefully discuss, and you can infer some implications both for ongoing institutional efforts to diversify their faculties, which are very common, and the implications this might have for research on issues having to do with non-majoritarian health concerns generally. I always like to snoop the university websites when I'm going to give a talk. And so this is one thing I kind of pulled out, which is that amongst an awful lot of documentation on the value of diversity for the University of Washington, they pointed out that it's very important not just to hire people, but to retain them. and have a plan in place so they're able to thrive in their position and ensure that resources are shared for their retention. So it's not enough just to hire people. The short version of the talk, too long didn't read, is that these hiring initiatives are doomed to fail if we don't do something about the Ginther gap, particularly when it comes to biomedical faculty. Most of you are aware, but if you are not, for most research institutions, grant getting is highly important. So here's from my institution, my department, Psychiatry at UCSD. At the 4-year review, our assistant professors are told they have to have active research grant support. They have to have publications and productivity, which, as you all know, comes from research grant support, and development of an independent research program, which means they have to be doing it themselves. And then, of course, the tenure bar itself, they have to have active research grant support, publication productivity, et cetera, et cetera. And, you know, it's not just about tenure, it's about the entire career. So this is sorry, I'm going to stop walking away from the microphone. If you want an acceleration, which is fine, you want to get fancier and more powerful in your institution, but you make more money as well for the duration of your career, you have to have exceptional research productivity, research grants. And this is a little slag on the fact that these things are hidden everywhere, which is that my department is very invested in this particular academic society. It's selective. And one of the criteria for membership is that you have an R1. It's explicitly stated, right? So these rules are all over the place. Well, NIH grants are, of course, important in the University of Washington. There are currently some 1,400 projects for a total funding of $764 million. You probably are aware that grants are important here as everywhere else. As with our standards and as with a number of institutions that you can readily Google, grants are important here as well. So the description of what a faculty member is has research, publications, grant dollars, all described. And then when it comes to the criteria for promotion and tenure, of course, it reemphasizes that securing extramural support is very important. So we all know this. Okay, so the Ginther gap. In 2011, Donna Ginther and colleagues, and this is a publication that came from the NIH, published this paper in Science showing that those NIH proposals that happen to have Black PIs at the helm of the proposal were less likely to be funded. And there were some follow-up studies focusing on different things. And then in 2019, Travis Hoppe and colleagues had basically a replication. This is the backbone of what we're going to be talking about today. So this is the original report in 2011. So this is looking at the success probability for R01s from 2000 to 2006. If they happen to have a white PI, 29% of them were being funded. If they happen to have a Black PI, only 17% of them were being funded, which works out to about 58% of the chance if the application had a Black PI, or something on the order of 1.7-fold advantage if that application had a white PI. Now, I'm going to do a little sidestep here. There were other things in this original paper, including this decrement in funding for applications that happen to have Asian PIs. The NIH and their subsequent publications and analyses have not focused on these other ethnicities and races as much as they did in the first paper. We don't know as much about it. I'm not going to talk as much about it, but suffice it to say, I think that there needs additional investigation into some of these other topics. So in 2019, as I said, there was a replication study. So this is now a new sample of grants, 2011 to 2015, jumping forward. You're after all the nice talk that was emitted from the NIH after 2011. And as many of you know, success rates had plummeted. But if an application happened to have a white PI, 17.7% of them were being funded. If they happen to have a Black PI, 10.7% of them were being funded, which worked out to be about 60% of the chance for an application with a Black PI and about a 1.7-fold advantage if the application happened to have a white PI. And so this is a perfect replication. It doesn't get much better than this. I'm going to be talking about the NIH because that's what I focus on, because that's where we know all the information so far. As this has gone along, other agencies that fund, major agencies that fund research, including federal ones in this country, are sort of belatedly coming to the table. Now, in this case, this is a study of NSF funding, another major research funder, that was extracted by people outside the NSF. So they didn't have access to exactly the same information. What I'm showing you here, and what they showed in their eLife paper in the fall, is from 2013 to 2019, that's what these hash marks are, 2013 to 2019. the funding probability at NSF relative to the baseline of that funding for every application in that given year. So what you see is that if the application has a white PI, they're sort of recently cresting around 10 to 15% better than the hit rate of average, right? So that's what this shows. At the same time, you have these sort of disparities for Black and Asian PI applications, and Hispanic and Latino applications are sort of catching up over time. And what I'm showing you here between the light or the open circles, the dotted lines, and the heavier circles here is the difference between research grant types at the NSF. So this is the difference between actual research, you might, think of it that way, that's the dark ones. And then they have some infrastructure grants. And so you need to get down into the details a lot of time to see that even though they're sort of generally improving, if they're doing it on the back of one kind of grant over another, we need to know about that. All right, getting back to Ginther, you've had a few seconds to sort of mull that over. If this is all new to you, you're probably thinking this very same thing, which is the immediate response and very natural of all scientists, well, but what about, and then you sort of insert this thing that you just dreamed up that surely must explain it. Surely it must explain it. And it boils down to situational factors other than race. So maybe what university you work for, and individual PI factors other than race, which show somehow the PI deserves their fate, like how good your science is, basically. They already took care of this. So the answer to many of your questions is read the paper and read the supplement especially. But one of the things the original paper did is let's use some statistical procedures to try to account for proposed things that might be contributing to this disparity, right? And so these are cumulative. They included a bunch of factors. Some of them focused on, sort of where you came from, where you trained, what the NIH funding rank was, previous NIH support. And then a model that looked at the characteristics of where you were coming from, where the application was coming from. So you say the NIH funding rank of your current institution. And something about your experience in the NIH system, because that can vary across the same university, of course. Did you have prior grants? Had you had study section experience, et cetera? And then finally, a model that controlled for this investigator-related productivity, citation matrices, where you published, et cetera. And the conclusion of that was it didn't really explain it, basically. It couldn't make the effect go away of race. There's some things in there, as I encourage everybody to read these papers, because there are things that just don't rise to the, the sort of abstract level and the sort of, easy memory. But, one of the things was that they noted that even if Asian and Black investigators got funded, they were unlikely to do it for a grant submitted once or twice. They had to revise more often in order to be funded. And then some things about African American and Hispanic less likely to resubmit a revised application. And it takes some thinking about, because at first you think, well, just advise people to keep submitting. But you really have to think about this in terms of them not being able to sustain that kind of rate of resubmission. Or whatever, having to do with job characteristics or what their roles are. I'm often asked about, well, what about gender discrimination in these talks? This is one of the follow-up studies I mentioned. This is Ginther 2016. And what I'm showing you here is now this application award probability you've been talking about, broken down for PhD holding and MD holding PIs for the racial categories. And what you see is this persisting disparity between white and Black applicants. Again, it's the same applicant pool, but no difference associated with gender. And down here, this is the per applicant award probability, which I didn't show you, which has to do with how, with a given investigator being funded as opposed to their applications being funded. Okay, well, so at least to the extent that this data set was examined, there's no intersection with sex. Okay, so what about these ideas about the quality of the scientists, right? So even though I mentioned to you, they included this in the very original paper, that wasn't enough. There was a follow-up paper, you don't really know why, but basically they thought they needed to be able to include measures of investigator quality and productivity that weren't fully captured in the original sample. Some of you might recognize this as p-hacking. But they were like, oh, we got a statistically significant effect, but they still only explained about half of the effect, right? And so they like to, you'll see a trend where they like to triumph, oh, we've explained part of this effect, but it's ever only part of the effect. And, you have to think a little deeper about what it is that we think about when it comes to measuring quality in science. So again, one of the things in this paper that came out was that for this sample, they looked deeper into the CVs basically of these applicants. Black PIs published the same number of papers during doctoral studies, but their papers received fewer citations. The gap widened as PIs. And they saw that, these sort of collaborator networks, co-authors and co-authors who are fancy, publishing in the top quartile were fewer. And smaller professional networks, they said, may constrain their publication count, citation, and research impacts. Well, of course it is going to constrain that, right? That's where citation counts come from. And so, one of the sort of conclusion points here is that on a very practical level, as you're trying to support the careers of junior faculty in your departments, you have to set the stage for collaboration and cooperation within departments and interest areas, et cetera, for these PIs to succeed. Same slide, but a different conclusion. And this is to emphasize that even beyond the departmental level, this kind of understanding has to be perpetuated up through the ranks at your university-wide promotions and tenures committees and deans, et cetera. And the thing you really need to push through is that this citation business is a consequence of funding. It's not a cause of the funding difference, because the citations come from funded research labs. So that needs to be thought about. Something else about, get my animation bad here, sorry. Another thing about citations and about them being this sort of objective review of quality of science. There's this thing called gender citation homophily. It's most well worked out in this sort of gender issue because there are a lot more data to work with, but suffice to say, this basically means that male research teams cite male research team papers more, and female research teams cite proposed cite female research teams more. And we're going to be talking for a minute here about the dyads of the first author and the last author. Hopefully it's familiar to you why this will be a convenient shorthand about the senior author and the major contributing author. So there are a couple of different papers, basically showing this where, either the papers are cited less if they have female authors than male authors. Maybe you can see that if you have, these sort of dyads, you can look at enhanced citation relative towards what they should get sort of by statistical chance. And while, there's two papers here, while both genders seem to exhibit this homophily, the effect is always larger for the males. This is an ethnic and racial contribution as well, although the data here are a little bit not as precise as you might like. This is a preprint still. And so what this was, a sample of neuroscience journals, looking again at these first and last author dyads of white. They had to group all authors of color. And so they had white, author of color, and then, the other two crossover conditions. And so basically they did this bootstrap procedure for all of the articles in these five journals over a period of time. And so in the middle here, what is this is kind of the bootstrap of what the expected outcome would be. And what you can see is if the papers have white dyads, they're cited more than the expected value. If they have authors of color at either end, they're cited less. And the top and the bottom are just, they tried to add some procedures to compare the papers to try to make them more similar. And the effect, so to speak, didn't go away. And then what I'm showing you here is who's doing that citing, right? So what this shows you is the same kind of bootstrapping procedure for the whole sample. The sample tried to be grouped by characteristics of the individual papers. And what it shows is that if you just look at the white citing papers, there's that disparity for white authored papers. There's that decrease in citation probability for authors of color. And it's much collapsed if the citing papers happen to have authors of color. There's still some effect. All right, so there's some evidence that even citations are affected by some of these factors. And it really comes down to funding, as I kind of am getting at, which is that not only do you have these citation biases, but the whole population of citations comes from funded work, right? And so those projects, those things, those PIs that are funded, their research traditions, those are the ones that generate an awful lot of citations. Okay, so turning from this idea of quality of the PI and whether or not they deserve grants, we're going to get to the idea of what's the content of those proposals, right? So you probably are aware that probably some kinds of research is more readily funded than other kinds of research. And that's in this study. So that was actually the main focus of this Hoppy et al. It wasn't just a replication of the original finding. What they did is they used this kind of informatics approach to try and group all these thousands of applications submitted from 2011 to 2015 in their sample for topics, things that seem to cluster together in terms of the words that were used. Excuse me, they came up with 150 of these clusters amongst the thousands of applications. And what they observed was that a good chunk, 37.5% of the applications that had Black PIs, mapped to just 8 of these 150 topic clusters. And of those 8, 6 had award rates that were significantly below the NIH average. Aha, it's just that African-American PIs are applying these wrong topics. Well, this is a regraphing of some data that they did publish. They didn't talk about in the paper, but they kind of hit it. This was a table that was in supplement S6. What I'm showing you is that, these are the applications with white PIs. These are 150 clusters now grouped into quintiles. You got 30 of these topic clusters per bar here. And of course, ranked by award probability, it ranged from something almost 25% of them being funded in some topics to something like 15% of them being funded in other topics. But across every single one of these topic categories, those applications with Black PIs were less likely to be funded. So it wasn't just explained by, oh, you just need to apply in the right topic domains. And echoing something I said previously, they're very excited. You explain 20% of this difference, but that leaves 80% of the difference not explained by this. Okay. This is another, so this is a little bit of a specific example of some of these topic issues. This is an experimental study where the subjects were drawn from R01 grant awardees. They were asked to review abstracts as if they're being reviewed for a journal. They're saying we're piloting a new approach to journal review. And the experiment here was that the subjects in the abstract were either reported as individuals, that's control, reported as male or reported as female. And it turned out that these target population of R01 holding investigators, the contribution to medical science was admitted or perceived to be greater for the research that was conducted in women, odds ratio 1.7. But they were almost twice as likely to recommend publication for that work when it included men subjects as opposed to women subjects, right? So there are these areas where we can identify places where even the topic where you can't come up with a really significant any plausible reason. Because again, the only thing that was manipulated was the sex of the participants or the supposed participants. And those things are hidden everywhere. So getting back to the NIH thing, what if it is the case? Thank you. What if it is the case that those topics that, as I mentioned, were disproportionate interest to those PIs who were applying who happen to be Black? What if they map disproportionately onto the topics that might be of interest to the 14% of the US population that's Black? Well, now we got a problem of systemic health disparity, right? Where the research on those topics that are, very important to populations in our country, who, by the way, pay taxes, which generates those NIH grants. The research on their interests is less common, and it reduces identification, detection, remediation, cures, et cetera, harkening back to this first slide I showed you from your alumni magazine about doctors saying how important it was to have doctors of color contributing to healthcare in your community, Seattle. So Mike Lauer, who is the head of the Office of Extramural Research, which is the one that hands out the grants at the NIH, published this paper looking at this, and pointed out that within the NIH, so the NIH is plural, for those of you, most of you know that, but it has many institutes and centers, all of which act sort of semi-independently. And he observed that, some of them, this is the Eye Institute, if you're doing eye research, you're in good shape at 26.9% funding probability. There's some other ones that are below 9%. And what Lauer's paper said was that 5 of the 6 institutes or centers that received a higher preference for these applications from Black PIs happened to have a funding rate that was below the average. And so that's these ones. And here's kind of an average here, right? So they're all down below in terms of award probability. Aha. those silly black PIs are applying to the wrong institutes or centers. And there's, he sort of tried to slough this off on, well, it's just this kind of, ecology of our grant awards if he had nothing to do with it. My co-author, Nick Gilpin, on some of these pieces observed that sloughing this off on a, research ecology or, award ecology that doesn't have anything to do with him. When you've got a chronic underfunding of those institutes, or sorry, I shouldn't say chronic underfunding. I should say when you've got a chronic lower award probability at those institutes and centers that are of interest to, in this case, Black people in our communities, you have the very definition of systemic bias and racism. Okay, so what was my point about that? My point is that that was the award probabilities. This is just in 2020, but this is pretty stable over time. This is all the institutes and centers with funding authority. This is their percent of the budget. And so National Cancer Institute gets all the money, of course. The other ones get varying. A lot of these ones get interest to those applicants that happen to be Black, get low percentages of the budget, low amounts of funding. And I want to talk about National Institute on Minority Health and Health Disparities, and to some extent the National Institute on Nursing Research, because they're kind of unusual when you think about what the National Institute on Health has in their institutes and centers in terms of research topics and health domains, right? Right, so I kind of went through this already, kind of preamble this, but why, the reason this question, like why aren't those ICs better funded to get up their success rates higher, right? What determines this assignment? Well, as I said, the National Institute on Minority Health and Health Disparities, for example, is supposed to cover health disparities across all the topics and all the domains of the NIH, right? So some grants that are being funded here are of interest to the other ICs that have much more of the budget and much better funding rates. So here's some examples from my institute or center of interest, which is National Institute on Drug Abuse. And you can go snooping around and Reporter, and you can find grants that are funded by this National Institute on Minority Health and Health Disparities. And then you can search out the PI and see what other funding they have, right? So here's an example. This is actually SBR grants. Two of them funded at NIMHD. And this person has another grant funded at NIDA, because of course it's on substance abuse, right? And if you look at the abstract, you can go into and look at the description of the project, they're exactly the same, with the single exception of the target population. Here's another example, same thing, MD grant is in this case an R03 in drug abuse. You look at the subject of it, and all the difference really is the target population. Another one, same deal, parallel drug abuse grants and MD grants, looking at exactly the same kind of science, with perhaps the exception of target populations. And then I like to point this one out because this is an HIV/AIDS grant. Now, people in my field for a long time have been sort of, whinging about how NIDA gives half its or a third of its money to HIV/AIDS research. It's our money. Well, it's not our money. Congress back in the 80s gave special allocations on HIV/AIDS to particular institutes or centers to deal with, right? So it's dedicated to that. So it's particularly egregious in my understanding when you have the MD paying for these grants on HIV/AIDS, for which NIDA is interested in the topic matter because they have another grant here on that. But they have this special allocation of funding, and they've sort of not taken up the charge to help out this institute or center that has less than 1% of the budget. And that was not meant to be snarky about individual PIs. You gotta live in the ecology you live in. A graduate student at UCSD, the CSU-UCSD Joint Doctoral Program, Sarah Chavez, pointed out to me something about these topics and research disparities, and we need to think more broadly about this, which is that, the interests of non-majoritarian populations hide everywhere in our science. And this was about something that's, I don't know much about this, but there's a very standard adverse childhood events scale that's used in a lot of research to try to determine whether or not an impoverished childhood upbringing has related to all kinds of health implications, psychiatric ones in my field, but everything. And what she was pointing out is that this standard scale, physical abuse, neglect, whatever, it's used in an awful lot of studies, kind of standardized. It leaves out things like deportation fears and events. It leaves out stereotype threat, racial discrimination, housing insecurity, bullying for gender expression, all of these things that might be of interest to populations in our country which have been, at least to this point, left out of this very standardized scale. And so that's why, just one example of why it's important that you have some degree of diversity in who gets to do research. This is the depressing part for any of you who are assistant professors in the room, sorry. It's my trigger warning. When I was, as Dave was mentioning, I started at Scripps Research Institute, which is a soft money institution. You have to have grants to have a job and salary, all that, and it's sort of Bucky Beaver. Well, the NIH hit rate is about 20%. So I just put in 5 grants. I can do that. I have a fighting chance. So you notice right away that I'm math challenged, because that's not the way it works. So the way it really works, it took me a long time to actually face this. So this, what this is a cumulative probability of getting at least one hit, given how many lottery tickets you buy, right? So the binomial probability of getting either to somewhat over 60% or somewhat north of 85%. Again, it's no guarantee, it's a probability of award. If you happen to start here at this 17.7% success rate, or if you happen to start with this 10.7% success rate, and it takes you, another 8 applications while that tenure clock is ticking to get to that same cumulative award probability, if you just start at this, this slight difference here. That's a lot of extra proposals. They don't write themselves, and they don't, they need money to generate the preliminary data to support them. They don't just happen by chance or by working a little bit harder. So sorry about that. That brings me to, I don't exactly know where to stick this one. I gave this talk at University of Nebraska-Lincoln. I kind of was snooping around on their site, and I found this awesome memo, because this describes a situation that, I've been on numerous diversity committees at various institutions, from undergraduate to graduate school, faculty on a graduate program. And now at UCSD, I have to do a lot of committee work. So I'm on an academic Senate committee for diversity, and indeed a university-wide 10 campus committee. Every time we talk about affirmative action or having to do something to dismantle discrimination and provide opportunity, you get something like this. Everything we have to judge against the same standard, right? Well, what is the same standard, right? So what I've been showing you this cumulative probability of award is this is not the same standard if you have to come to that tenure bar with an R01 in hand, right? If it requires 8 more applications within that 5-year period or so, that's not the same standard. That person is not up against the same challenge. And I think it's really important to think about this and this curve when you're dealing with your promotions and tenure committees. For senior faculty, I don't mean for junior faculty. Don't use it as an excuse. So, what can we do? So sort of mid-conclusion of this is that, the hiring is not enough for those of you who are involved in institutional hiring. You got to focus on retention and tenure, and not just on the original hiring. This Ginther gap affects R01s. R01s are a huge contributor to evaluation of careers and are likely to be so going forward for a very long period of time. Keep that in mind. Your new hires need more runway. Hope I've shown you this. They need more startup, they need more resources, they need more non-exploitative collaborations that aren't putting labor, institutions are fond of hiring new scientists that have new techniques that everybody wants to use and collaborate with. Make sure those are non-exploitative and they actually go the other way for your new faculty. Sometimes this idea of topic diversity and health disparity is part of the push. I hope you noticed, even though I didn't really point it out too much, that the preferences and associations of PI characteristics with topics is only a fraction, right? So there are people of color that are interested in things that have nothing to do with health disparity or diversity. And so we can't always just think of this one thing, but it can be part of that push. It can be part of that interest in the part of hiring institutions to hire people that are interested in topics of health disparity. So what are the implications when you do that for their funding? Are they going to be particularly at risk? And what does that mean for traditional evaluations of merit, especially when it comes to citations, what kind of journals they're able to publish their papers in. Again, going back to that citation, or the experimental study with male and female subjects, right? Presumably what that says is if somebody who is focused on women and women's health issues, they're just less likely to get published in the fancier and fancier journals, and it's harder to get published, right? So you need to think about how this goes into traditional merit evaluation. So since I've been giving these talks, NIH has been doing some things. So I like to, credit where due. In 2011, they boosted the appropriation for NIMHD, a 17% increase above the previous year. So they did increase some things. Dedicated some funds towards different issues having to do with health disparities. We still, I believe, I didn't check recently, but I believe we're still in a continuing resolution. We don't have a formal budget, but there was a proposal to increase this even further in 2022. And then National Institute on Nursing Research, which I didn't focus on, but it has the same characteristic of which, their primary focus is not on these topic domains, but research will come in on different topic domains that might be of interest to the other ICs. They're also getting more money. That's good. The NIH is focused on historically Black colleges and universities. I was sort of struck by, there's this white paper that pointed out that if you look at STEM PhDs that happen to be Black in this country, there were 220 in 2013 coming from just one, HBCU, Howard University. And that number was just one fewer than those coming from Stanford, Harvard, MIT, and Yale together. So yeah, it's a good idea that, if you have this pipeline problem, you should probably go to where the people are. And so there was this sort of, again, this is a white paper. It wasn't really anything specific, but it is an interest of the NIH in trying to get more money into the HBCUs. The impact, I'm gonna be a little bit skeptical. I mean, a lot of it's kind of non-specific and sort of going down to institutions and telling them how great it is to get federal money, how it works, to assist in getting funding and cultivate HBCU senior management. You can think about how your deans respond to the idea of free external money. But as Hoppe showed us with this sort of across all research domains, it doesn't necessarily help to say let's get a lot more applicants if there's still this persisting review bias. So it's a mixed bag. The NIH is taking to bragging about their per investigator success rate. So that was I did introduce that a little bit without describing it too much in that Ginther paper on gender intersection. But this is the idea of looking at, instead of the percent of each application or percent of the population of applications that's getting funded, it says in a given year, you got a PI who's applying, are they getting funded? Whether they get, put in one application, get one award, whether they put in 10 and get 10 awards, whether they put, 10 and get 5, all counts the same. So it's the funding rate for the PI. This is for research projects grants, a catch-all for research mechanisms of the NIH. And what I'm showing you here is this is the percent of those PIs being funded if they happen to be white, and here it is something 35% or something. The gap to, this is the African American or Black PIs. And then as you might notice right here in 2020, as interest ramped up in the Hoppe paper, there was a little bit of an improvement. All right, great. They're sort of closing this success rate gap. And it was true for R01s as well. It's not like it's specific to, R21s and R03s or something, but the NIH, I tell you, they want to brag about this. We're closing this percentile gap. But as I hope I mentioned, I may have forgotten to mention, African-American Black PIs are low single digits, sort of 2, 3%, 4% at best. And so a percentage point for each of these categories is not equal to the same number of grants and therefore the same amount of money. And so every percentage point for white applicants is 257 PIs funded. Every percentage point closing this gap, so to speak, is 12, right? So if there's maybe 4 or something percentage points still left to go, it's only 48. It's a fraction of 1 percentile point for the white PIs. So while the NIH is doing some things, I still think we should hold their feet to the fire about what they're actually doing, what the impact is. Okay. All right, so this is for the PIs in the audience, active scientists, reviewing papers, reviewing grants. I used to say all this pablum down here, and I've taken to just pointing out this one. Look, we're peer review. This is us, right? The primary input, not the sole input, but the primary input to what gets funded at the NIH starts at peer review. Peer scientists saying, this is good science, this is not good science. Now, we've come a long way since that original Ginther paper, but, you know, the sort of knee-jerk response, I hope I've convinced you that we're not talking about this, is that, well, I don't know anybody who says racist things on study section. I don't do it. We're not flagrant racists. Hey, we don't even know what the race of the PIs are. You know, it's not about these Klansters on study section. I hope I've convinced you of this. These are subtle effects. These are statistical effects. These are things that are present everywhere. It's a situation with death of 1,000 cuts, right? So finding the one thing, one reviewer, whatever, is not the solution. And even so, you know, nobody's free of implicit bias. All the implicit bias studies have shown that, right? So, but it is about this guy. So, you know, we're 10 years, 12 years after Ginther, almost 13. We had a perfect replication of a subsequent set in 2019, despite all of the nice talk. I didn't show you this, but there was confirmation at the individual institute or center level. We can maybe get to that in the question time. And then there was some pushback from the office of the director, Francis Collins, against all this stuff. And, you know, the takeaway here about us peers is that our inaction has now become action. So I like to think about systemic factors and what we can maybe do systemically to help. I like to think of this in terms of the inherent circular conservatism of NIH grant review, in the sense that you have to have already gotten an R01 grant in order to sit, for the most part, to sit in those panels that are reviewing it. This is a recipe, especially when we know that grant review is subjective. There's no sort of objective, you know, sort of stepping through the quality or merit, because good scores are given to topics that individual people think are significant, are important. That is a subjective judgment. You think it's more important. Using the methods that you approve of. You describe methods, you're like, oh, that's a good way to go about it, right? That's kind of subjective. If you don't think that, think about in your own fields, the different methods that different people who are trying to address the same problems use. It's subjective. And they, you know, there's some aspect to which the grant has to be written in the right way, right? This grantsmanship that you, presumably you junior faculty have been going to grant writing courses. They talk a lot about this grantsmithing behavior. It's kind of subjective. And despite the fact that NIH panel selection has rules for diversity in gender, geography, science topic, et cetera, you know, this inherent circularity just can't be escaped by this. And, you know, especially when it comes to Black PIs, they're only about 2% of reviewers, which is less than 1 per study section. That doesn't provide any sort of balance, even if you assume they were not exhibiting any of these biases. So, and this applies to paper review too. I think the significance part of it is one thing that you can actually introspect about and do better on, right? And that is a matter of trying to get people to stop reviewing grants on the basis of what they find to be significant, despite what we're being asked to do. And really try to think harder about what is the application telling you about what the significance is? What's significance to them, right? And I think that's an actionable thing that we can do internally. There are some structural aspects of review which are just, you know, could be applied. So this is this kind of NIH mantra that's been going on at least as long as I've been reviewing a study section, which is the burden of triage shouldn't fall on. And so triage is a process, for those of you who don't know, where about half of the grants that are submitted to a given, issued to a given panel for review, they're reviewed by 3 reviewers at home, but they don't come up for discussion in the panel. And so they're considered to be the lower half of the applications. And the NIH has rules for years that burden of triage shouldn't fall on, for example, early stage investigators. You can't just like triage all the early stage investigator ones to review more of the established investigators. It shouldn't fall on smaller mechanisms. Well, Ginther showed us, there's data that applications from Black PIs were at 1.5 times more likely to be triaged. Simple fix, right? a technical fix. The burden of triage shouldn't fall on those applications that have Black PIs. Or any other, any other category that's shown to have a kind of a bias. It's a proposal. I didn't talk about this, but I will just mention it. I have time, I think. So one of the conceits of the NIH system is only the most meritorious applications can be funded. I hope I persuaded you that's not necessarily true, but this gets very particular in terms of exception pay, gray zone, or pickups. Right. So most of you are aware that the NIH grant, as I said, the major input is the scores that come out of study section. Grants are ranked, they're percentile. But then there's a level of program activity at the institutes and centers that decides of those which they're going to fund. And they can go outside of this strict order of review, and they do. So one of the things that came up in Hoppy is that if they looked at, again, their sample of proposals that they were looking at in that study, there were 119 grants with white PIs funded at a percentile rank of 35 or above, because they broke it down by percentile category. Those of you who've been active applicants recently know that 35% is not good. Those do not get funded. We have been seeing, obviously the funding rate overall for this was at 17.7% for white PIs. The sort of guarantee level for funding is as low as 9%, it's 8% at some institutions, and there's sort of a gray zone above that. There were 119 of them picked up. There was 0 funded with Black PIs at 35 percentile or above. 0. The notion that it's about, and of course, there's some in the lower percentile ranks, there's a variable percent of them that were getting funded. So of course that, things just beyond the obviously funded scoring, there are Black PI applications that are not getting funded, some that are getting funded, and so you could exchange these horrible, by their lights, by NIH's lights, scored proposals. Those are Black PIs, but they didn't do it. So, the idea that this only the most meritorious applications are funded is complete nonsense. On the home stretch here, I want to leave some time for at least a couple questions. I kind of went over this, but one of the things you can do, and this is more general, is we need to abandon this idea that we have this objective business where citations, of course, they identify the best science. It's convenient untruth. Those citations, I think I've mentioned repeatedly, they come from well-funded research topics. They come from well-funded labs. They even come from well-funded pedigrees. There are other data I didn't talk about in terms of the citation amongst academic pedigrees. And the real takeaway here is that those metrics are a symptom of the funding disparity. They're not an excuse like that follow-up Ginther paper, right? They're not a reason for it. They're a symptom of the funding disparity that goes across decades, by the way. Okay, so back to the education part, I did write a paper, an op-ed on this. You can go look at it with Nick Gilpin, who honestly was really the driving force. I'd sort of exhausted my ability to deal with this online. We're not the only ones. This is a commentary that came out more or less the same time. It's very direct in terms of what the NIH should be doing. And now there's, I can tell because I watched the citations to our eLife paper, these kinds of things in various topic domains of all your research interests, your clinical specialties are just coming out, on a quarterly basis, not a monthly basis. Thanks for coming, and I would be delighted to take any questions.
We have time for questions. I just want to make a note. I got to come up here because I just want to make a note for people who are on Zoom. Please enter your questions into the chat, and I will relay them forward to our speaker. So, thanks. Question.
You've listed a bunch of things that people looked at as potential cause, which explain even half of that. But one of the most remarkable things you point out is at the end, where you're talking about grants that are on the bubble, where program staff determine what's high program relevance. And that was an even bigger gap than we spoken about earlier. So it sounds like something that institutions can do. Program staff are going to program staff get to know the investigator. And presumably that impacts their determination of what is high program relevance. And so efforts to get junior faculty to know their program staff would seem like a really low-hanging fruit that all make sense.
Yeah, so the question, if you didn't hear that on Zoom, was about the pickups, the exception pay, and this should be a target. And it is true. Do keep in mind that those are a minority of the grants that are, well, depends how you look at it for given institutes and centers, but those pickups are a small fraction, and so it's not the only answer. And should this turn into renewed calls for faculty to schmooze with program officers, it's always a good thing to schmooze with program officers. But again, it's not the whole story, and it may not necessarily be the solution. And it kind of smells of this kind of finding the Klansman on study session, which is that it's just one of the cuts. Yes, it's great to get to know your program officers, but we don't know the degree to which their decision making can be swayed by that, right? There's this evidence from the Hoppe paper that there's a disparity in those pickup behaviors, and that kind of behavior is completely opaque, right? They don't have to really explain why they chose one over another. And then finally, of course, as I said when I first saw Ginther in 2011. This could be solved tomorrow by Francis Collins walking down the hallway with individual institute centers and directors and saying, can you please fix this? This is making us look bad. Make this go away. And they could, because the directors of institutes and centers are the ones that do the final sign off. But of course, NIH is running in abject fear of anti-diversity political elements in Congress, frankly. So that's why another reason why expecting them to do things overtly is not necessarily the solution. Dana?
It seems like, notwithstanding the anti-woke pushback on this, when NIH had this problem with PSIs, they just changed the funding line for PSIs. So what's stopping them from just changing the funding?
Yeah. So Dana's asking, they did this with early stage investigators where they just decided there was a funding disparity, and they didn't go into any of this analysis. They didn't go into any of these real finding reasons. They just put down their fist and said, we're going to start using naked top-down affirmative-based or quota-based affirmative action to do better for early stage investigators. And that's what they did. I don't know. So structurally, it's the same process, right? The only difference is the willingness to do it. Dave?
We have a couple of questions in the chat.
Yep.
One is, in your opinion, what are concrete actions URM early faculty can do to help increase their likelihood of receiving funding? So what can early stage underrepresented individuals do to enhance their chances at the NIH, get those grants flying out the door frequently as possible? I am not kidding. The only solution at present is to keep applying, to keep working the system, to learn more about as you can, and put about as many credible, I emphasize that because everybody's like, well, if you put out too many applications, they're garbage. They have to be credible applications as possible. It is the only solution at this time. I have a question that you mentioned, this idea of who makes up the grant review panels, and could there be an increased representation on the panel? I know that NIH has made an effort for early stage investigators to be included. Do you think that's a place where improvement could be? And then the counter question is, I mean, those of us who sat on the review panels, it's a lot of work.
Yeah.
And is there a kind of a disproportionate burden placed on the URM faculty to serve on more committees again? So thinking about those two arguments.
Yeah. So the question is about, can we just change the review panels to include more minority participation? And of course, that's a burden on those. Again, it's not just that it's 2 and 4% of applicants, it's 2 and 4% of our faculty, as I pointed out at the top for University of Washington. So I think the strongest structural change to the constitution of study sections that we can do, and this generalizes far beyond this issue, and I've been hammering away at this since I was an assistant professor and very frustrated with what I perceived as being a bias against newbies, is that I think we should stop putting people on study section who have already won an R01. And the population of study section should be drawn from the applicant population and not the successful population. And that will address things related to age, that will address things related to topic domains that can't gain traction, potentially. Again, it's a small effect, it's, statistical, whatever, but drawing our reviewers. And, remember, so I also cut my teeth in study section in the midst of a prior purge of assistant professors. It was sort of when the budget was getting terrible, success rates were going down in the 2000s. And all the senior people were like, we got to get rid of all these assistant professors. They're killing my grant. Well, assistant professors were never more than 10% of reviewers overall. They weren't killing people's grants. It wasn't them. And it's just like people argue about, and you come to this, as most of nowadays, to be an assistant professor, you're like 36 or something, right? You're old. You've been trained. You've been beaten you've been in this industry for so long. Like, how to review grants as well as anybody who's funded does, right? And so this has been my point, is that we're not losing anything by having the less experienced, the people that haven't yet been successful, and we're potentially gaining, right, this counter to this inherent circular conservatism of grants being reviewed only by those that have already been successful. That's the best thing I've been able to come up with in terms of real structural change about study session.
Yeah, but some more in the chat. One is, what can universities and mentors do to help people?
What can universities and mentors do? Well, I hope I told you several times. When you hire faculty of color, you got to give them more resources. It's only fair. They need more runway. They need bigger startup packages. They need better help with trainees and staff, et cetera. And then you've got to sort of perpetuate this kind of information into the promotions and tenure process. That's what you can do as a university.
Another question that's treated, is there any data on the ratio of funded applications to the different academic populations? White, African American, Black. I mean, maybe the difference comes from different populations as well. So it would be better to care at the ratio, not the net out.
Most of what I've been showing is the percentage, sort of hit rate by applicant pool, and not raw numbers, because they'd be a lot worse if it was just raw numbers, because again, Black PIs are only 2 to 4% of the applicant pool, if I think that's what's being asked. Let me go to somebody's raising their hand.
The topic choice is a critical factor. And so I wonder what's been done in NIH. And so I am it was a topic of interest to you guys. What's been done to look at that institute where topic choice is essentially controlled and one can look for other factors?
Yeah, so what about looking at the topic choice within institutes and centers? Unfortunately, I sort of alluded to this, that there have been a couple of the institutes and centers that have coughed up data, 3 of which have been almost perfect replication of the aggregate. Turns out that NIDA, my favorite IC, apparently doesn't, but it's very limited data, 1 fiscal year. We don't know much about this at the individual IC level. We don't know much about the decision process where, as I was saying, there's grants that maybe are in a topic domain and they have a minority health component to them. Why are they being assigned to NIMHD? If they can't be funded, why are they not being picked up by the parent institute? We know essentially 0 about that. So one of my pulpit items is to keep banging away. We need to know more about that process. We need to know more about why those grants aren't then being pulled back to the parent institute for funding. And as you might imagine, I do have a colleague in my department who is a longtime NIAAA program officer, and he basically admitted what you might suspect, which is that the topic domain institutes have gone along over the years thinking, aha, if we can get one of our grants over in NIMHD, we get one of our things for free. And that's been their attitude. And I wouldn't be surprised if that had been the general attitude. And that needs to change, which is why we need to keep the fire on their feet, to ask, how is this happening? Why are you not picking them up? It's great that a larger percent of this budget is now going to NIMHD, but still, why aren't you still picking up more grants, right? Cancer Institute and IAD. So we don't know much about it, is unfortunately the answer.
So I read Nakamura commentary.
Yeah.
Or your response to it. It seems to me that some of its findings speak to this issue.
Okay, so the question is about the Nakamura paper, which is an attempt. So one of the things I didn't touch on, everybody's initial response, especially when they're trying to find the Klansman on study section, is blinding of review will be the solution. And so this was an experimental study he's referring to. Richard Nakamura was the previous head of the Center for Scientific Review, which is the part of NIH that handles most of the grant review. And they tried to do it. They tried to do a blinding study. And they sort of convened ersat study section reviews. And I don't know if this is the finding you're referring to, but the major outcome of this is what blinding did was it removed apparently some of the pro bias for majoritarian applications without really budging the merit scores for the PIs that are underrepresented. Is that what you're referring to?
Yeah, and also the fact that, or at least in your response to it, you cited the fact that potentially there are other factors besides just the review that in fact topic choice maybe.
Yeah, I mean, we don't know where that came in and how that kind of change in the pro bias, if you will, came. Yeah, I've been very skeptical about blinding things because they don't work. So I've even looked at that study, like the blind was broken very frequently. There are, I think, bad effects of having a statistical breaking of the blind. You know, people say, well, if it's only, 10% of them are broken, no big deal. I think that can have a huge distorting effect. And it can have a distorting effect in ways that perpetuate the power of known labs. So I'm not a big fan of blinding. And if we do it, it is going to be a radical reshaping of what the proposal to the NIH is in order to get out any possible hint of who that research group might be. I mean, you can think, those of you who've reviewed grants or written them, like this is this will be, it's hard to even imagine what the nature of that proposal would be in order to really effectively guarantee blinding.
And then-
That would be one thing you'd have to get out of there, right? And you'd have to get the citation, everything about the PI would have to be out of there. Jake.
Has anybody looked at this in terms of aids or other career development activities?
Yeah, so Kenny Gibson, I think it is a NIH person who's done some stuff. He's published some, I think it's him, has published some papers on K-Max, K99 showing disparity of award. Yes, it exists. It hasn't been worked over as deeply as the RMAX, but it's there.
What about the K-R?
Can't remember if that was part of that study or not. There's also, I think there was also, Dana, you may remember, there's somebody who did some stuff that maybe even didn't make it into a publication. It's like a
Yeah,
blog post or something. Yeah, so there are little bits out there. Yeah, one more.
Sounds like a kind of digital whereas are interested in seems like one way to promote applications is to actually promote the topic areas that tend to be most prevalent, and RFAs and other things. That at least might get people of color into the room, getting their first application. That's something that
Yeah, you've seen some funding opportunities come out that are on minority health issues, and again, it's 1,000 cuts, so therefore 1,000 bandages help. So it's likely to do it. One concern I have, of course, is that because we have to tiptoe around affirmative action and direct solutions, particularly in hiring the University of California and in the state of Washington, thanks to Ward Connerly. There's a chance, just because of the statistical numbers of applicants, that you're going to have an awful lot of benefit going to majoritarian PIs from these diffuse initiatives. And that's not good. It's one of the reasons I'm not, I didn't talk about pipeline that much. One of the solutions to all this is this assertion that it's just about pipeline. We need to get a lot more people into the system, loaded up with more postdoc fellowships, et cetera, not paying attention to the man behind the curtain, which is the R01 disparity. And the problem is, of course, is that a lot of these diversity supplements go to majoritarian PIs who already have grants. And yes, you get trainees who are supported on fellowships or diversity supplements, but where's all the credit going? What science are they working on? Who's going to accrue in the long term statistically the benefit from that? It's the majoritarian PIs who already hold the grants. right?
Argue that these get this experience of learning how to write grants, go on to get F grants. Not just having process.
Yeah, I mean, that's the theory, right? That we just kind of are gonna load up the pipeline and make them better at writing grants, but every single piece of data deep and buried in these papers shows that you're just throwing more people into the buzzsaw because you haven't fixed the R1 review problem.